Hello, everyone. Good day to you, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. We are delighted to welcome you to our new webinar series, Teaching English with Graded Authentic Global Resources. Over the next 4 weeks, this series explores different ways in which these resources can benefit learners and support our work as teachers. Next week, we will be exploring emergent language with Danny Norrington Davis and Richard Chin. Then Dr. Amini Dudi will be helping us find effective ways to integrate global issues into learners' classes. And finally, Vicky Samuel will bring the series to the close with a look at planning lessons with videos, resources that have all these focuses, as well as digital literacies, critical thinking, and learner training built into them. I am Vicky, one of the ELT specialists at Sensations English, and we are very grateful to Gemma for starting this series off with today's webinar, which is focused on accent diversity. And these variety of the accents reflects on the word that speaks English today and identifies important areas for students to be helped with their learning. Just a reminder, if you are watching this video live right now, a CPD certificate will be sent to your email 24 hours after the session has finished. And if you're watching the recording online, please make your own record of your professional development activity. This webinar will last an hour, and it's include questions at the end for Gemma's talk. Please write your questions in Q&A box, and I will make sure to answer all the questions and ask them all from Gemma at the end. Sensations English is focused on helping teachers develop their skills. We are delighted to be hosting regular webinars for teachers to support quality, evidence-based practices. You can view all our previous webinars on Sensations English webinars website, including our monthly webinar and a special series on using videos in ELT, and these recorded all come with the slides from the sessions too. And hope they will help you develop your own practice and expand your use of authentic resources with the classes. Sensations English lesson resources are a great new advance in ELT content. We are delighted to offer teachers hundreds of videos and news articles, resources, all graded at 5 different CFR levels and all with ready-made learning activities. They made video and news accessible to all learners and hassle-free for teachers. There are 3 new 5-level resources to use every week, and giving you access to the most up-to-date content to use with all your learners. Our Sensations English Teachers editions, including logging for all your students and a digital teacher gradebook tools, which let you organize your students in the classes, set tasks and monitor them live, and also review your learners' progress over time. To start with these great resources into teachers editions, you just need to go to the link that I'm just going to pop in to the chat, and then start to do your exploring basically Sensations English. Now, to tell you a little more about today's speaker, Gemma is an EAP teacher and program coordinator in English language unit at University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. She's also the editor of the ITEFL pronunciation and special interest groups biannual journal Speak Out, and she is the joint SEEK coordinator. She is specialist in pronunciation, with the particular passion for researching and teaching with diverse L2 and regional L1 accents. She's the creator of the Scottish Sound School, a resource to help new arrivals to Scotland acclimate to unfamiliar sounds of a Scottish speech. Gemma, thank you very much again for being here. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for having me. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see that okay? Just give me a thumbs up if you can, or Vicky.
Yes, we can.
Lovely, okay.
Fantastic, thank you.
Great. So thank you again for my introduction, Vicky, and to all of you for turning up and coming here to discuss and listen to a topic that's really close to my heart and close to that of my organisation that I'm part of, IFFL Pronunciation SIG as well. The need for us to be creating and using a variety of different English accents in all of our teaching and learning. So why is this topic important to me, and why do I feel that we need to be discussing it more? Well, I've been pretty lucky in my career to date that I've been able to teach in a few different countries throughout Europe, but also in the Middle East. And one thing I've noticed, no matter where I am, no matter where I'm teaching or the group that I'm teaching, certain things seem to be universal. And one of those in particular that I've noticed throughout my whole career is students' feelings towards English accents. In particular, their feelings towards those accents we call prestige models. And by that, I mean what we probably know best as standard British English, also known as BBC English, and until recently, the Queen's English, now the King's English in the UK, certainly. So it has lots of different names, this particular prestige model. We also now have General American English as well, which, and both of these are very dominant in our ELT industry. I'm going to talk more about that in just a second though. So I noticed that my students had very strong feelings about these two particular accents. They were very attached to them, and they were so used to them that anything else was considered bad. If it wasn't these two prestige models, it was bad English. And so this came up so often, I decided this is something that I want to do a little bit of research on to try and determine what's going on. And so you'll see on the screen a piece of research that I wrote up and published last year. And it was investigating how students who have only had access to these prestige models, how do they then react, or how do they feel when they start to interact with other types of English? I've lost my screen there. So yes, that's where all of this session today really has come from. And when I was doing that research, I was lucky enough to talk to many international students and interview them. And so a lot of the recommendations that I'm going to be making has come directly from that research. In this session, I'm going to, in general, talk about our current situation in English language teaching, which I've just kind of briefly mentioned, and the consequences this has for our students' perception and production of English. Following that, I'm going to provide some solutions and examples of things that we can do to rectify and rebalance this problem. Okay. So before I start completely, I don't know if you can see the title that I've put on this. What I've asked at the top of this slide, you can see it, I think. I've said, someone's just given me the thumbs up, that's great. I can't see it, but as long as you can, that's fine. My title at the top of this slide is, what skills do you think these medical professionals need to be effective in their jobs? Just to give you a little bit of background, this is a picture from a British NHS hospital, where you can see that we have this very diverse international team of medical professionals all working together. So I'm going to ask you in the chat box, what, aside from the medical skills and the medical knowledge, what skills would they need to communicate effectively with one another and with their patients? Pop your ideas then in the chat box. So some strategies, for sure, strategies. They have to be able to understand each other. Yep, so Rabina has talked about ELF, English as a lingua franca, intonation, yep. Critical thinking, sure, yeah. Okay, so we can see from the picture that we have a predominantly international team. We have some Spanish medical professionals, some Greek, Spanish, German, and we also have two, which we presume are native speakers or maybe even bilingual speakers, British Pakistani and an Irish English speaker. For all of them to be able to do their job and effectively and communicate effectively with one another, they need to accommodate for one another when they're talking about some pretty serious topics and some pretty serious subjects. They have to be understandable to one another, and they have to be able to clearly communicate what they need to get their job done and give someone the effective medical treatment that they need. And this is something which takes practice and takes guidance and has to be refined. We don't all naturally speak international English. It's something that develops over time with practice and with guidance and tuition. So to make this team of international medical specialists, it takes some preparation. And we can think ourselves as teachers, if some of these L2 international speakers were our students, what would they need? What guidance would we have to offer them so that they could go out into the world using English in this very important professional context? Any ideas? Cultural awareness, for sure. Intercultural competence, yeah. Yeah, so there are some things that we can do in terms of pronunciation. I mentioned a moment ago accommodation, that will help us to be understood by everyone, an international audience, not just certain speakers from certain language contexts. Let me go into this in a little bit more detail. As many of you coming here will probably already know, the majority of resources, published resources that are commonplace in English language classrooms and training courses around the world, they aren't helping us to prepare those people that we saw in that previous picture. They're geared instead to provide us with exposure and tuition in these prestige model accents, either standard British English or general American English. Unfortunately, they don't help us, the majority don't help us to prepare students for real world English, where they will be using the language with others, largely from other countries. So using English as their shared language or lingua franca. So this is a serious problem that we have. And I think a lot of us know, so in the comments, about English as a lingua franca, English as an international language, that we need to be focused on making ourselves understandable to everyone. Despite this, most of our most reached for materials are not reflecting that. They continue to have this focus on prestige models. And in 2021, Marek Kiczkowiak, who I've quoted here, did a very interesting study whereby he actually interviewed content writers, materials writers from English language course books and textbooks. And he asked them why. Why is it that we're still continuing to use prestige models in all of our resources and we're not more internationally focused? And the materials writer said, it's not us, it's the publishing houses. The publishing houses are pressurizing us to continue to put these prestige models into resources. So I think we do have a bit of a problem, certainly in a lot of our most used and most reached for resources. The problem is that when we have students who have only been exposed to these prestige models, these dominant forms of English, this has consequences when they start to hear English, which is not these two varieties. First and foremost, there is a cognitive cost. When students hear an unfamiliar variety of English for the first time, or maybe not for the first time, but certainly an unfamiliar variety or an unfamiliar speaker or accent, this takes longer for the brain to process. And it's not just something that our students have, this is the same for all of us. When we hear a new and unfamiliar accent, it takes us time. It takes us longer to process those sounds and to decipher the meaning. And unfortunately, sometimes students don't understand this, that the lack of familiarity is what's causing them to struggle a little bit. But what they need to know is that the more familiar an accent is, the easier it will be for them to understand. So there's something that we can do about this as teachers to reverse this problem, or at least to alleviate it a little bit, by making or helping students, facilitating them to become familiar with diverse varieties of English. There's also another factor at play here, a very human factor. We prefer what we are familiar with. When we look at a variety of different studies where students have listened blind, not knowing where people are from, what accents they have, they often still reach for the prestige models as their preference. So again, this large amount of exposure to these prestige models primes us to find them easier and in turn to like them better than other varieties. So I feel that we're doing a huge disservice to students by not giving them more exposure, more familiarity or familiarization with other varieties of English. I'm going to go into this in a little bit more depth now and talk about the cycle that can sometimes happen deriving from not an insufficient amount of exposure. So first of all, we have learners, as I've just finished describing, learners who are only exposed to certain models. They lack awareness of other varieties. The consequence is reduced comprehension, or it takes longer for them to comprehend new and unfamiliar varieties. And sometimes this reduced comprehension can increase communication breakdowns. I don't know about you, but certainly for my students, a lot of them seem to get quite anxious about communicating in English. And often this comes from the embarrassment when people just cannot understand what they're saying, or the reverse, they cannot understand what people are saying to them. So this is a very real problem that they can deal with. And I feel I really understand this myself, because I was a language learner myself. I did my undergraduate degree in Italian, and I went and I lived and studied in Italy. And there was a group of people which I always avoided speaking to, and it was older Italians. And whenever I had contact or communication with them, I just could not understand what they were saying to me, and it got really embarrassing. I couldn't understand. People were trying to help, and nothing worked. And so I just avoided speaking to a certain demographic, because I was just mortified every time this happened. And I can understand why it happens, because those speakers were probably less familiar communicating with an international speaker, and I was less familiar with their specific type of Italian. So I feel quite personally that I understand that kind of anxiety that students feel when they're worried that this is going to keep happening. And as often happens, when this happens repeatedly, learners can start to internalize negative beliefs about difficult accents and the speakers who have them. And this can develop into a suspicion about or distrust of unfamiliar varieties, believing that anything that derives from these prestige models is difficult to understand and is not proper. Of course, all of this comes down to this lack of familiarity and exposure. I've taken some of the key vocabulary items out of that cycle and put them onto this slide here. And I've also put them, I've put 5 action statements that I often hear from students regarding them. So we have beliefs, suspicions, tolerance, comprehension, and confidence. I'm going to give you just a minute, and if you like, you can try and match 1 to 5, those 5 key effects or consequences with the action statement that comes from the student. If you like, you can pop your answers into the chat box. So we've got 5C. So 5 is confidence, and C, I'm worried, I won't understand. Anyone else? I'm going to give you the answers in just a minute, just because we're tight on time. Okay, so here are our answers here. Suspicion. Suspicion and beliefs are quite similar, but suspicion is more, as I said, distrust. I don't want to speak to them. They are from X place. They don't speak properly there. Any of you heard this one from your students before? Oh, I've heard it so many times. Beliefs. I know that X type of English is the only proper type of English, to learn. Again, a pretty common one. Confidence. I'm worried I won't understand them because of their accent. That was me for sure. Comprehension. I really struggle to understand them because of their accent. And finally, tolerance. I get really frustrated listening to them. They are so difficult to understand. Has anyone experienced that from or heard these from their students in the classroom? I've certainly noticed the tolerance aspect when I have 2 students sitting together and one of them gets annoyed listening to their partner because they're unfamiliar with their accent and take them longer to understand. Buka saying D mostly struggle because of the accent. Yeah, I think that's probably the most noticeable one, this struggle to understand. Yeah, Srilatha saying D as well. Okay. What I have for you here is a real example that I saw very recently on LinkedIn. And it was an example of a professional speaker, someone who is a TED speaker. She's done a TEDx presentation. And she talks about her experience when she moved from Indonesia to Singapore. And she was unfortunately labeled in a negative light because of where she came from and the type of English that she used. So I presume that she talked with an Indonesian accented English. And she said that people said to her, oh, she's Indonesian, she's too slow. Her English can't make it. And that lovely one, did you speak English? I can't understand what you say. I've certainly heard this last question from some of my students who lack tolerance, lack patience. They don't want to listen if they can't understand quickly and easily. Perhaps some of you have experienced lack of tolerance yourself if you're an international speaker. Feel free to share your examples in the chat box, but certainly you will likely have observed a lack of tolerance in your classroom, particularly if you have a multilingual classroom where you have lots of different accents that students might be unfamiliar with. Okay. So far, I've been talking a lot about perception, the perceptual effects of lack of exposure to diverse Englishes. We get the lack of comprehension and all of the effects, the negative effects that can come from that regarding listening and understanding, but we can't not talk about the productive element as well. So there is a final consequence with regards to producing and pronouncing English. This goes back to Marek Kiczkowiak once again. As I said at the beginning, he did some research in 2021 and 2022 looking at textbooks and how much English as a lingua franca or English as an international language is featured in textbooks, commonly used textbooks, and in particular with regards to pronunciation. So in this study that I'm going to share with you, he found that actually the pronunciation content of many of our most published and most commonly used resources, they are often only sharing or only using, including features that are native speaker features. For example, connected speech, assimilation, vowel reduction, and prestige model vowel replication. So when we have all of these native speaker features in our textbooks, what happens then? Well, we know that these are difficult. They can be complicated for our students to pick up. But I think we really have to address the key point or the key feature of this, and that in an L2 to L2 international classroom or communication, these features are not necessary for intelligible communication. L2 English, intelligible L2 communication, where both students are L2 users of English. They're not necessary. In fact, these features can reduce intelligibility between L2 speakers. So they're not necessary for communication. And we have to say it, are we setting students up to fail? We are giving them these examples and these models of native speaker features, but we know that it is very unlikely that students will ever go on to develop a native speaker accent. It's very unlikely. It's not impossible, but there are so many variables involved in becoming native-like in any language. And especially for adults, it is very unlikely. So we are setting students up to fail, only providing them with these native speaker features, which don't always enhance intelligibility around the world in L2 communication. And it's also important to consider the reality. The majority of our students are going to be communicating in English more with other international speakers like them. The ratio at the moment of L2 to L1 English users is approximately 3 to 1. So we have far more international English users than native speaker users. So that means that the likelihood of our students meeting and conversing only with L1 prestige model speakers, so with our BBC English or our general American speakers, the likelihood of that happening, low. But the likelihood of our students meeting and conversing with other L2 speakers, high. That is very likely. So we have to consider this. What is their future? What are they planning to do with their English? For most of our students, like the picture I showed you at the beginning with the medical team, they are going to be using English with other international users. So we need to provide them with what they need to do that effectively and successfully. I'm now going to share with you some of the suggestions or solutions that I think can help us to open our students' minds and give them the exposure they need to use English intelligibly and to accept diverse English accents more. certainly with my students, they often say to me, oh, it's so difficult in English. There are so many different accents. In my country, there's only one accent. Now, I don't often believe it when students say this to me. I'm not an expert in every country in the world's accent, but I think it's quite unlikely that one country will have only one accent, but I could be wrong. So sometimes they need a little bit of awareness raising to accents in their own L1 and using that then as a bridge to help them consider accent diversity in English as well. One way that I've done this successfully comes from Robert Walker, who in 2017 talked about this with his Spanish students. So he would begin introducing them to the topic of accent diversity by asking them these questions in figure 1. So accents in your own language. They were thinking about accents in Spanish, and they had to list all of the Spanish accents they could think of, which accents they liked the best or least. They had to match up certain qualities, certain adjectives to different accents. And they had to really investigate their personal beliefs about diverse accents, because we know that attitude and personal beliefs about accents is something that can be, quite significant and have quite an effect on our motivation to understand. So after doing this, he would then ask them these questions about English, trying to get them to connect the dots and see the reflection between their mother tongue and English. So they had to look at the statements and they had to decide if they agreed or disagreed. How did they feel? We should all speak English with the same accent. The best accent for students to imitate is an RP accent, also called BBC English. It's easier to understand native speakers than non-native speakers. And a bad accent is like wearing shabby clothes to a job interview. It gives the wrong impression. So encouraging active debate, discussion about accent variety in general before bringing it into a more specific discussion about English accent variety. And sometimes that's enough to get students to open up to the real possibility that accent diversity is something that exists everywhere, and it's not just an English thing. Some students may not be totally convinced by this. So sometimes, especially if you have students that are not linguists, most of us, if you're not teaching students that are, doing a master's in TESOL or something like that, they need some facts. And this is what Rosanna Lippy-Green calls the linguistic facts of life, some fundamentals that they need to know because they won't have this awareness. And these 3 fundamentals are, as I've said before, a key reason you will likely find this accent more challenging because of your familiarity with it or your lack of familiarity and exposure to it. This is integral. Society, nothing in linguistics supports the idea that certain accents are inherently more intelligible than others. This is a socialized concept. It is not a scientific concept. And finally, as I mentioned already, it is not impossible to achieve L2 native likeness in adulthood, but it's unlikely. If our students do not need to speak English with a native-like accent, and I would argue that that means most of them, we can spend our time far better focusing instead on the smaller range of features which will really increase international intelligibility, rather than focusing on every single sound of a native-like pronunciation to native-like levels. That for some could be a waste of their time. Okay, and the last thing is providing realistic and relatable accent models. We need to provide the exposure until it becomes commonplace in the English language field and certainly in our resources. One way we can do this is through the use of near-peer role models. And I've got a quote here from Neil Curry, who published an excellent article in Pronsig's Speak Out. And he says that near peers are a powerful device for the pursuit of the ideal L2 self, where the success of others can help us to see such a future for ourselves, a possible future, a real future. Therefore, to use the ideal L2 self as a motivational tool, near-peer role models are a prerequisite. Just a clarification, a near-peer, what he's referring to here is from our students, it's someone from their language background. So if you have a student from Spain, for instance, a near-peer would be a Spanish speaker of English. And it would be a Spanish speaker of English that is a little bit more proficient in English. So we're using near peers to say, this is what you could become. This is what's possible for you if you apply yourself. You could be like them. Okay. Near-peer role models in the classroom can also be helpful because they focus us on a realistic model and a realistic goal rather than this native-like goal that we were so concerned about. It increases learner autonomy because students are encouraged to go out and find a near-peer role model for themselves. We are not spoon-feeding it to them saying, look at this person, what do you think about it? We're encouraging them to find this for themselves. And as I've mentioned already, this can be really motivating for students because they see someone like themselves who is succeeding. And that can be more inspiring than a native speaker model in many instances. One way that we can do this is to ask students for homework to go and find a famous near peer from their own L1 background. So these can be people such as sports stars, actors, musicians, singers, politicians. So there are lots now, the world is our oyster now with the internet because we have things like YouTube and all of these different apps where we can get videos and audio of all of these international speakers. So asking students to investigate maybe one from their L1 background and to do a little bit of research. How did they learn English? What's their story? How long did they study English for? Did they come to an English-speaking country? Did they move? What was their story? So they have to do a little bit of research and then bring that research into the classroom to share with others. So again, it's giving people ideas about what is possible. All right. In terms of supporting production, we couldn't talk about intelligibility without discussing the lingua franca core. And I'm sure some of you here today will know what the lingua franca core is. It is a list of pronunciation features in English which are considered most crucial and that we should prioritize in the classroom, because when they are not used accurately, they are more likely to cause a communication breakdown. So Jennifer Jenkins created this list in the 1990s, and it has categorized features as per their importance. So on the left-hand side in green, she has categorized what sounds, what features are considered the most essential for intelligibility. And she determined this by, she had about 10 hours, 8 to 10 hours of audio recordings of L2 communication, her L2 speaking students, where they were interacting with one another. And she listened to hours and hours of these recordings, and she identified every single time a communication breakdown occurred. And this is how she created this kind of ranked order of which features to prioritize. So she found that in her data, consonants, misused, misarticulated consonant sounds caused serious communication breakdowns more frequently than vowel sounds. She also found that consonant clusters, where we have consonant sounds right next to each other, when we have consonant clusters at the beginning or in the middle of a word, these are also, if they are mispronounced, more likely to cause a communication breakdown. She talked about vowel length, and in particular, this refers to the length of a vowel before a voiced or an unvoiced consonant sound. So, for example, in the word mat, M-A-T, the vowel in the middle, the A, is shorter than the vowel in mad, where it has a voiced consonant at the end, mat, mad. So she found that when students didn't or misused the vowel length in these circumstances, that it often caused a communication breakdown. So she felt that preserving these vowel length contrasts were really important for intelligibility. She also talked about the importance of nuclear stress, and this is when we make one syllable in a phrase or an intonational phrase or chunk of language, when we make one syllable more intelligible than all the others. This is what we call nuclear stress, also called tonic stress, you might know it. So again, when students weren't using nuclear stress accurately, it was causing more communication breakdowns. In the middle of this, this grid here, you'll see the non-damaging section or the non-damaging features. Now, again, the results of this, the data that I'm sharing here, it came from a study done in the 1990s. And Jennifer Jenkins always imagined that people would go on and do further research on this data and refine it and get more conclusive information. So I want to talk a little bit about word stress, because when we think about word stress, lots of people are like, how can word stress not be important for intelligibility? Well, a lot of us find that word stress can be very important. So this is a kind of neutral zone in the middle. She said that with regard to word stress, it's not that she didn't think it wasn't important. She felt that the data just wasn't conclusive enough. And further studies have since stressed how important word stress can be for intelligibility. So for me personally, I would move word stress into that core features column. You might find it a little bit different with your own students. Dental fricatives are another one in that middle column, the sounds. These are not damaging to international intelligibility, but our students do not have to use them in order to be understood. Finally, I'd like to draw your attention very quickly to the last column, the damaging features to intelligibility. So when we have two L2 speakers conversing together, these features can reduce intelligibility. I'm not saying it will, but it can reduce intelligibility. So when we reduce the vowel or use weak forms or connected speech, all of which are integral and very common in native speaker speech, this can reduce intelligibility between L2 speakers. So the lingua franca core is probably a really helpful thing for teachers, so we can prioritize what do our students need to be intelligible English speakers in the real world. And I've got this out of order here. Laura Patsko has a lovely structure for applying to listening exercises and activities to help students gradually become accustomed to diverse accents. And in this particular structure, she doesn't mention accents at the beginning, you'll see. She encourages us to provide students with an audio exercise with an international speaker. But instead of saying you are going to listen to this Spanish speaker, this Chinese speaker, wherever they're from, all we're asking students to do is to listen for the gist, for a general understanding, and then listen again for a little bit more detail. And then we're going to ask them to listen and write down what they've heard in a particular section, or identify when they hear a word. The sections that we're asking them to transcribe or identify are going to contain features which might be a little bit different in that particular international speaker's accent. So for example, maybe they use the R sound differently in their particular accent. or a different type of sound in a completely different type of sound. So we're planning in advance the feature that we want them to discover, but it's not the focus of the whole activity. Students are gradually discovering this international feature of English when they're listening in this more general understanding, this more general gist listening that they're doing. Because sometimes attitude can get in the way of comprehension. Certainly for my students, if I say, okay, we're going to listen to a Scottish speaker today, they go, oh no, oh, it's so difficult, we're never going to understand. So they just close the door immediately when I say that. But if we start listening just for understanding, just for the gist, and then slowly we refine our listening activity to reflect different features that they might find a bit different, then they're more open-minded to this accent diversity. And once they've learned this, we ask them to apply this new learning to more listening. Okay, we've heard that this speaker pronounces the R sound a little bit differently. Let's look at let's listen to their second section of speech. Do you notice it happening again? So we've opened their mind, we've broadened their understanding of accent diversity, and then they apply this to their next listening section, their next audio. And finally, they need to reflect. How was this for you? Was it difficult? Was it easy? What questions do you have? Have you learned something new? So getting them to reflect on the process, because usually what you'll find is it wasn't as difficult as they imagined it was going to be. I did have a little example to show you, but just before we started the session today, I had a bit of a problem with my audio. So I'm going to point out where you can find it and show you a little bit about how we can use Sensations English to provide these diverse international audio samples. So give me a second, I'm just going to share my screen. And Vicky, you'll be glad to know that this is me coming to the end now. All right. Can everyone see that okay? I've just brought up the website. I'll do that again just in case. Okay. So if you can see that okay, I hope you can. This has come from the Sensations English website, and it's a lovely short audio, about 2 minutes in length, about how avocado planting in Kenya is affecting natural wildlife. And I believe the speaker on this is a Swahili mother tongue speaker. And so what I would do is I would choose the level of audio I want to present to the students. I'd ask them to listen and give me a general understanding. We'd listen again, focusing on our international speaker, and maybe they would transcribe a little bit, or they put their hand up when they hear a particular word I've asked them to listen for. And then that's broadening us into this discussion of accent diversity. What did they hear that surprised them? What was a bit different to what you've heard before? Something that I really like about the Sensations English website, if you're signed up for it, you'll know that you get these emails once a week telling you what's new. But what I think is the best thing about these emails is it tells you what accents you're going to hear in these videos. So if you know that your students maybe have a bit of they've internalized some negativity towards a specific accent, perhaps they think it's harder than a different type of accent, you can actually go onto the website and you can type in, the accent or the country that you want them to practice listening to. So we can expand and provide them that greater exposure, hopefully making them a little bit more familiar and, reducing that intolerance that they might have developed due to lack of familiarization. So we can use the website to provide that exposure that they really need. So you can type in the country, you could type in the topic, or you could look at your emails and see the type of accent that's in the latest videos. All right, so this is me coming to the end, everyone. I hope you found it useful. Before I go, here is just my final slide. And this is just, so the title of this session was, what do we need to know about accent? For our international learners in international classrooms, we need to know that there are negative consequences of lack of exposure to diverse English accents. Lack of exposure causes reduced comprehension. This in turn can cause increased communication breakdowns, which can cause communication anxiety and internalized negative beliefs about diverse Englishes. But we can change that. We can provide the exposure and the guidance and the reflection in the classroom to help students become more familiar and more tolerant to diverse global English accents. And here are my sources for today, and I think they will be available to you on the Sensations website, I believe. Yeah. And here's my contact information. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks, Gemma. That was wonderful. What an insightful session. Thank you so much for that. I've got one question in the Q&A box, and I'm just going to read it aloud for you. So they ask, what were your principal theories? How can I apply this theory to young learners? Well, we all have faced with this, and especially from parents in the schools. Additionally, how can internationally convince these schools and families who are stuck in the native speaker model?
That's such a good question, and there's so many layers to it. So for thinking about the young learners in particular, I think this is a great time to introduce them to diverse English accents, because they haven't been conditioned to fear them, and they may not have had the negative experiences that come for many older students. We often find that students are just, young learners certainly are more curious, and through things like songs and poems and interactive activities, we can be using diverse accents, and I think they're far more open to it than their older peers, certainly. In terms of parents, for sure, I know in different countries they pressurize different offices and different, didactic offices and schools that they think that a native speaker teacher is a must. We know for sure that that is not the case. And really, it is up to us as teachers, as owners, school owners, but also within our communities and in our countries, there has to be some political pressure as well, such as I know in the European Union, it's illegal to discriminate against someone because of their accent, and we cannot discriminate against international teachers because of their accent. So I think that needs to grow and expand. But certainly sessions like this, where we're talking about it, sharing information, going away and spreading that information to our colleagues, is important to begin the discussion and try to encourage people to be more open-minded about the reality. Qualifications and experience make a good teacher, not their accent.
Yeah, excellent. I do have a question as well. So you mentioned about the classes with lack of tolerance, the international classes. Have you got any kind of suggestions what teachers, especially teachers of non-native speakers, they need to do when they're facing this type of classes? They're non-native themselves and they're dealing with international students with lack of tolerance. What they should do in this type of classes?
Yeah, ask why. Why do you feel that way? Because when you ask, it's rare that students actually have an answer other than I just don't like it. So often it's not based on logic, it's based on emotion or a conditioned experience. So if students say, oh, I don't want to listen to this, why? What's the problem? Try to unpack that and get to the source of why students are they don't want to listen to a certain accent. And if it is, because it's hard, well, this is why we're doing it. We want to make it easier for you. And by listening and just gradually opening up the features of this new and different variety, we're going to make it easier for you.
And is there anything you think is important for school managers to do to support teachers when it comes with intolerant students?
Hugely important. Certainly, if this does come up in the classroom, international teachers, L2 speaking teachers, may not feel confident enough to deal with it themselves, and they shouldn't have to. absolutely, managers should be very clear that it is not acceptable for students to communicate that way with their teacher or about their English. Yeah, that needs to be pretty clear and enforced.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Gemma, today for your talk, and wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I'm sure our audiences have enjoyed the session as much as I did. I'm just going to share my screen and let everyone know that if you haven't already register, remember to sign up for our other 3 webinars in the series, and join us next week to explore emerging language with Danny Norrington Davis and Richard Chin. And you can also catch up with all these webinars, the previous series and the current one on our website. I'm just going to put all these pages that you need, because some of you ask about where we can find them and have access to the webinars. I just put them in the chat box. Thank you so much, Gemma, again. Thank you. And I hope everybody else have enjoyed the sessions of today, and looking forward to see everyone next week at 2 o'clock. Thank you. Thanks, Gemma.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Bye.